somewhere right now, someone is scrolling through their phone at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, carrying a weight they haven't told anyone about. And somewhere right now, a short clip, barely 3 minutes long, is quietly making its way across the internet. No flashy editing, no dramatic music, just a priest sitting in front of a camera saying something so simple that it stops people mid-scroll. Within 24 hours, that clip had been shared thousands of times. Comment sections filled with people saying the same thing over and over. I needed to hear this today. I was about to give up. How did this find me at exactly the right moment? That's the strange thing about a message rooted in divine mercy. It doesn't need special effects. It doesn't need a celebrity face. It just needs to be true. And true things have a way of cutting through the noise of a world that is exhausted, anxious, and quietly starving for hope. The teaching that spread overnight wasn't new. In fact, it echoes something spoken from heaven decades ago, recorded in a small worn diary by a Polish nun named Senior Fina. But somehow, when explained clearly in plain language for a generation drowning in guilt, comparison, and despair, it hit differently. This is the story of that message, why it spread, who it reached, and why, if you're watching this right now, there's a good chance it wasn't an accident that you found it either. Because here's the part almost nobody expects. The message isn't really about a viral video at all. It's about you and a door that has been standing open a lot longer than you think. Let's walk through exactly what it said. It started as these things often do, without any fanfare. A short video was uploaded. No elaborate production. Snorts no thumbnail designed by a marketing team. Nothing engineered to go viral. It was simply a recording of a talk on divine mercy, the kind of teaching that has been shared in parish halls and retreat centers for years. But something about the timing, the wording, and the way it was framed caused it to spread in a way nobody predicted. Within hours, the comments began stacking up. Not the usual scattered reactions you see on religious content, but something more raw. People weren't just saying nice video or God bless. They were confessing things. One person wrote that they had been planning to walk away from their faith entirely, and this was the last thing they watched before deciding to stay. Another wrote that they hadn't set foot in a church in over a decade because of shame over something they had done years ago, something they were certain could never be forgiven. A third simply wrote, I don't believe in coincidences anymore. To understand why a short teaching video could cause this kind of reaction, you have to understand what it was actually about. It wasn't a message about rules. It wasn't a message about being good enough, praying hard enough, or performing your way into God's good graces. It was the opposite. It was a message about a mercy so vast that it doesn't wait for you to clean yourself up first. This idea traces back to a series of private revelations recorded by a young nun in Poland in the 1930s. She described encounters in which she was told, in essence, that mercy is not a reward for the righteous, it is a rescue for the desperate. The greater someone's brokenness, the greater their claim on that mercy, not the smaller. This was a radical reversal of how many people, even lifelong believers, had quietly come to think about God as a scorekeeper, a distant judge, tallying wins and losses, waiting to see if you'd earned his attention. The video reframed that entire picture. It described God not as someone standing at a distance with arms crossed, but as someone who runs the way a parent runs toward a child who has fallen and scraped their knee, not stopping to ask what the child did to deserve help first. That single image, repeated in different forms throughout the clip, is what seemed to break through people's defenses. Why did it resonate so strongly now? Context matters. We are living through what many describe as a mental health crisis unlike anything in recent memory. Rates of anxiety and depression among young adults have climbed sharply over the past decade. Loneliness is being studied by public health officials the way epidemics once were. People are more connected online than any generation in history, and yet somehow more isolated than ever before. into that exact environment dropped a message that essentially said, you are not disqualified. You are not too far gone. You are not the exception to mercy. You are exactly who mercy exists for. There's a particular phrase used in the video that seemed to lodge itself in people's minds and refuse to leave. The idea that no matter how many times someone falls, no matter how long they've been away, no matter what specific thing they think makes them unforgivable, the response from heaven is not rejection, but relief that they finally turned around. Not where have you been, but welcome back. Several viewers later commented that they had grown up in households or attended churches where the emphasis had always landed heavily on sin, punishment, and fear. They knew intellectually that God was supposed to be loving, but emotionally they carried around a picture of him as someone perpetually disappointed in them. The video didn't ask them to abandon the seriousness of sin. It took sin seriously, in fact, more seriously than a shrug, but it separated the seriousness of the wound from the willingness of the healer. A doctor who takes an illness seriously doesn't refuse to treat the patient. If anything, the more serious the illness, the more urgently the doctor moves. That reframing changed the emotional temperature of the entire message. Instead of guilt driving people further away, it became the very thing drawing them back. Shame by its nature tells you to hide. This teaching told people the opposite. Hide nothing, because the thing you're most ashamed of is precisely the thing mercy is most eager to reach. By the next morning, the video had been shared across dozens of pages, translated informally into other languages by viewers typing out their own captions and stitched into shorter clips that spread even further. What had been a routine recording of a routine talk had become almost overnight something people were calling a lifeline long before any video, any hashtag, any comment section full of strangers admitting their secrets to each other. There was a notebook, unremarkable in appearance, filled with the handwriting of a young woman with only a few years of formal education, written in installments over nearly 6 years. She wrote in obedience to a spiritual director who wanted a record, kept not because anyone expected the world to read it one day, but because he sensed something important was happening and didn't want it lost. The young woman was a religious sister living a hidden, largely unremarkable life, cooking, gardening, tending to the daily tasks of convent life. By any outward measure, she was nobody of consequence. That in itself became part of the message's power decades later. God did not choose a theologian, a bishop, or a scholar to carry this particular message to the world. He chose someone easily overlooked, someone whose qualifications by human standards were essentially none. What she recorded over those years was a series of encounters she believed were with Christ himself. Conversations, visions, instructions. At the center of nearly all of them was a single repeated theme: mercy. Not mercy as an abstract theological concept, but mercy as an urgent, personal, almost desperate offer being made to a world that had, in her telling, largely stopped believing it was possible. One image described in her writings became particularly iconic. Rays of light streaming outward, one pale and one red, symbolizing water and blood, understood traditionally as symbols of cleansing and life. Beneath the image, a simple phrase: Jesus, I trust in you. 5 words. No complicated theology required to understand them. Just an act of trust offered by anyone in any condition at any moment for years after her death. Her writings were treated with caution by church authorities, partly due to translation issues that made some passages sound doctrinally confused, and partly due to the broader caution the church exercises around private revelation. It wasn't until decades later, after careful re-examination, that the original Polish texts were properly translated and the message was formally recognized and embraced at the highest levels of the church. A feast day was established, a devotion spread. What had once been dismissed as the imaginings of an obscure nun became one of the most widely practiced devotions in the modern church. This history matters because it explains something about why the viral video hit as hard as it did. The message wasn't invented by a content creator trying to find an angle. It wasn't a modern reinterpretation designed for social media. It was, in essence, an old message rediscovered, dusted off, translated into contemporary language, and handed to a generation that happened to be more starved for it than any before. There's something almost poetic in the fact that a message about being overlooked and unworthy came through someone who was, by the standards of her time, overlooked and considered unworthy of much attention. And there's something equally poetic in the fact that it resurfaced centuries later through the most overlooked and dismissed corner of modern life. A short, low production video that nobody expected to matter either. Several viewers who commented on the video mentioned they had heard the phrase divine mercy before, but had never actually understood what it meant beyond a vague sense of God forgives. What the video did, drawing on this deeper history, was make clear that this wasn't a soft, watered-down version of forgiveness. It was something closer to rescue. The diary describes encounters in which the depth of human sinfulness is not minimized. If anything, it's described in stark, uncomfortable terms, but the response to that sinfulness is not backing away, it's leaning in. One detail from the historical record stood out to many who researched further after watching the clip. The sister reportedly described being told that the greatest sinners have the greatest right to trust in mercy precisely because they need it most. Not the moderately flawed, not the mostly good with a few slip-ups, the ones who think they've wandered too far to ever come back. Those specifically were described as having priority. For anyone who has spent years quietly convinced they're the exception, the one person whose specific failures put them outside the reach of forgiveness, that detail lands like a direct hit. It's not a general reassurance. It's a specific dismantling of the exact lie that keeps so many people locked in shame and silence. This is likely why the viral clip spread the way it did among people who wouldn't normally engage with religious content at all. It wasn't preaching at them. It was answering a question they'd never said out loud. Is there a version of me too broken to be loved? And the answer, drawn from decades-old writings that had somehow waited patiently for the right moment to resurface, was an unambiguous no. But knowing the history is only part of the picture. The video didn't just repeat old information, it applied it. It took this centuries-old message and pointed it directly at very modern wounds. Comparison culture, chronic anxiety, the exhausting pre-pressure of needing to appear fine online while falling apart privately. That application is where the next part of the story picks up to understand why this particular message landed so hard with a younger audience. You have to understand the emotional terrain that audience is standing on. This is a generation that has grown up curating a version of themselves for public consumption. Carefully selected photos, filtered moments, achievements broadcast, while struggles are hidden behind closed doors. The result is a strange, quiet epidemic of feeling like everyone else has it together except you. That constant low-grade comparison creates us a very specific kind of shame, not necessarily shame over one dramatic failure, but a diffuse, exhausting sense of not measuring up, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not disciplined enough, not spiritually good enough. It's a shame without a clear edge, which makes it hard to address directly. You can't repent of not being enough, you can only carry it. The viral message spoke directly into that gap, though not in the way most people expected. It didn't offer self-esteem talking points or generic affirmations. It offered something sturdier to claim that your worth was never actually up for debate in the first place, because it was never based on performance to begin with. The teaching drew a clear distinction between two very different questions people often blur together. Am I good enough and am I loved? The video's central argument was that these questions have completely different answers, and confusing them is where so much modern anguish comes from. One especially resonant section of the talk addressed the specific fear so many carry that if people really knew what was happening behind the curated feed, the anxiety, the resentment, the secret habits, private failures, they would be quietly written off. That fear, the video argued, is exactly backwards. It described mercy not as something that requires you to hide your worst moments to remain acceptable, but as something that specifically activates in response to those worst moments being brought into the light rather than buried further. This connects to something practical that seemed to strike a nerve with viewers. The idea of trust as an action rather than a feeling. Many people commented that they'd always thought of faith as something you either have or don't have. An emotional state either arrives or doesn't. The video reframed trust as a decision repeatable in any moment, regardless of how someone feels. You don't wait to feel confident before trusting. You trust, and confidence sometimes follows. Sometimes slowly, sometimes not at all. But the trust itself is the whole act, not a feeling attached to it. For a generation exhausted by the pressure to feel a certain way about everything, happy enough, positive enough, grateful enough, on top of everything else they're supposed to be. This was oddly freeing. You don't have to feel forgiven to be forgiven. You don't have to feel worthy to be loved. The feeling might show up eventually, or it might not, but it was never the requirement. Several comment threads under the video turned into informal support groups, strangers responding to each other's confessions with encouragement instead of judgment. Itself a small, unplanned demonstration of the very message being discussed. People who would never say these things to their own families were saying them to strangers online and receiving in return something they clearly weren't getting enough of elsewhere, a response that didn't flinch. There's also a generational wound around authority and institutions that this message quietly bypassed. Many younger viewers expressed distrust of organized religion generally, citing scandal, hypocrisy, or simply feeling judged rather than welcomed in religious spaces. But the content of the video wasn't institutional in tone. It wasn't defending an organization. It was describing a relationship, one person's trust in someone who runs toward them rather than away. That distinction mattered enormously to viewers who had one foot out the door of faith altogether, but hadn't quite closed it. What emerged from the comment sections pieced together painted a picture of an audience that wasn't rejecting the idea of God. They were rejecting a distorted, exhausting version of God they'd absorbed somewhere along the way, one who required constant performance and offered conditional approval. When that distorted picture was replaced with something closer to the original message recorded decades earlier, something shifted, not for everyone and not permanently for all of them, but for enough people in a strong enough way that a quiet, unremarkable video became something people were calling, without exaggeration, life-changing. That raises an obvious next question. What practically were people supposed to do with this? A feeling of relief is nice, but it fades. The video didn't stop at reassurance. It moved into something more concrete. And that's where the real turning point of the message begins. If the first half of the message was about dismantling fear, the second half was about what to actually do next. Because relief without direction tends to evaporate within a day or two. This is where many viewers pointed to a specific section of the clip and said almost word for word in the comments, "This is the part that changed everything for me." The turning point centered on a very old, very simple practice tied to this devotion, showing up honestly in a moment of reflection or confession and saying 5 words, "Jesus, I trust in you," not as a magic formula, but as a decision made in the middle of doubt, not after doubt has been resolved. The video was careful to explain that this isn't about achieving a certain emotional state first. It's about making the act of trust the starting point, not the reward at the end of a long spiritual effort. For many viewers, this reframed something that had felt impossibly abstract into something almost embarrassingly small and doable. They didn't need a dramatic conversion story. They didn't need to have their entire life sorted out before approaching God. They needed to say 5 words and mean them as much as they currently could, even if as much as they currently could wasn't very much at all. Several people described trying this that same night, not with any expectation that it would fix anything, but almost out of desperation, the way you try something when you've run out of other options. And what they reported back in comment after comment wasn't fireworks or instant transformation. It was something quieter, a loosening, a sense that whatever they'd been carrying didn't have to be carried alone anymore. One person described as the first night in months they'd slept without the familiar knot in their chest. The video also addressed a common obstacle head-on, the fear of insincerity. Many viewers admitted they didn't feel a strong faith that saying, "I trust in you," felt hollow or even hypocritical given how little trust they actually had. The teaching's response to this was direct. Trust that starts small, even trust that feels forced or thin, is still trust. Nobody is required to arrive with a fully formed, unwavering faith. The whole point of trusting in mercy rather than in your own spiritual performance is that the quality of your trust isn't what's being measured. The willingness to reach out at all is the thing that matters. This section of the video also touched on a practice associated with the same devotion. A particular hour in the afternoon traditionally set aside for reflecting on this mercy, and a specific prayer repeated using ordinary rosary beads. The video described this not as a rigid obligation, but as an invitation, a regular, repeatable moment to return to this same truth, especially on days when the initial relief of the message had faded and old fears had crept back in, as they inevitably do. That detail, the acknowledgement that fear creeps back, seemed to matter a great deal to viewers. The video didn't promise a single moment of realization that would permanently erase doubt, shame, or anxiety. It described something more realistic, a practice you return to again and again precisely because the old patterns of fear and self-condemnation don't disappear after one video or one prayer. They come back, and the response isn't despair that they came back. It's simply returning to trust again as many times as necessary for an audience deeply familiar with the exhausting cycle of trying to fix themselves, failing and feeling worse for having failed. This was a significant shift. Instead of framing the spiritual life as a straight line toward perfection, the message framed it as a repeated return. Fall, trust, return, fall again, trust again. Not a ladder to climb, but a door you can walk back through as many times as you wander away from it. Some of the most striking comments came from people describing years of feeling stuck in that exact cycle, trying to be better, failing, feeling too ashamed to try again, drifting further away, and repeating the pattern. What the video seemed to offer wasn't a way to break the cycle by trying harder. It was a way to break it by trusting more and trying less to earn what was already being offered freely. By this point in the video, the tone shifted from explanation to something closer to a direct address, no longer describing the message in the third person, but speaking straight to whoever happened to be watching at whatever hour of the night they happened to find it. And that shift, more than anything else, is what viewers say pulled them from passive watching into an actual response. What happened after that response is where the story becomes less about a viral clip and more about individual lives. And that's the part worth slowing down for. Every viral moment eventually fades from the algorithm, but what people do with a message tends to outlast the platform that delivered it. In the days and weeks following the video's spread, a pattern started to emerge in the responses. Not identical stories, but a shared shape to them, the way separate rivers all eventually reach the same coastline. One recurring account came from people who described years of estrangement from any kind of religious practice, of often rooted in a single incident or a slow accumulation of disappointments, a painful experience in a faith community, a personal tragedy they felt God had failed to prevent, or simply the quiet drift that happens when life gets busy and faith gets deprioritized. What several of these viewers described wasn't a dramatic, instantaneous return. It was smaller than that, a decision to walk back into a physical space they hadn't entered in years, sit in the back row and simply be present without any pressure to feel a certain way or perform a certain level of belief. Another recurring theme came from people currently in the middle of something they described as unforgivable in their own minds. An affair, an addiction, a decision that hurt someone they loved, a choice they'd made that they were certain disqualified them from any kind of spiritual peace. For these viewers, the specific detail about the greatest sinners having the greatest claims seemed to function almost like a key turning in a lock they'd assumed was permanently sealed. Several described reaching out to a priest for the first time in years, specifically because the video had addressed almost too precisely the exact fear that had kept them away, that their specific failure was somehow the one exception to the rule. A third pattern emerged among people who weren't dealing with a specific moral failure at all, but with something quieter and harder to name. A persistent low hum of anxiety and self-criticism that had nothing to do with any single bad decision and everything to do with simply feeling like a disappointment, generally without being able to point to why. For this group, the message seemed to function less like a rescue from a specific crisis and more like a slow recalibration of how they saw themselves day to day. Several described printing out the phrase, "Jesus, I trust in you," and putting it somewhere they'd see it daily, not as a magic charm, but as a small repeated interruption to the automatic self-criticism that had become background noise in their thinking. It's worth pausing on something important here. Not every response was dramatic, and not every viewer described a clean, resolved outcome. Some commented honestly that the relief was temporary, that old fears crept back within days, that they weren't sure the message had worked in any measurable way. This honesty matters because it reflects exactly what the video itself had warned about, that trust isn't a one-time fix, but a practice returned to repeatedly, especially on the days it feels least convincing. What united nearly all of these accounts, dramatic or quiet, resolved or ongoing, was a shift in the question being asked. Before encountering the message, many viewers described operating from a question like, "Have I done enough to deserve help?" After encountering it, the question many described shifting toward was different. Am I willing to trust even without deserving it? That shift from earning to trusting appears again and again in the language people use to describe what changed for them, regardless of their specific circumstances. There's also something worth noting about the ripple effect beyond the original viewers. Several comments described sharing the video with someone else, a sibling going through a hard time, a friend who had stopped talking about faith altogether, a parent estranged from their adult child over some unresolved hurt. The message once received seemed to prompt people to hand it forward almost instinctively, the way you'd pass along water to someone you recognized as thirsty because you'd been thirsty yourself not long before. This is in some ways the least surprising part of the entire story, even though it's the part algorithms can't measure, a message about mercy.